In the summer of 1944, the Third Reich still clung to the illusion of victory. Despite mounting losses on multiple fronts, despite the inexorable advance of Allied armies from both east and west, Adolf Hitler remained convinced that Germany could still turn the tide of war. And nowhere was this delusion more dangerous, more catastrophic in its consequences, than in the vast forests and marshlands of Belarus, where nearly 800,000 German soldiers stood as the backbone of the Eastern Front, Army Group Center. The name itself carried weight, spoke of power and permanence. This massive formation, one of the largest concentrations of German military strength anywhere in the world, occupied a bulging salient that Soviet commanders had grimly nicknamed the Belarusian Balcony. It was a position that jutted eastward into Soviet-held territory, a remnant of the triumphant advance of Operation Barbarossa 3 years earlier, when German armies had swept across the Western Soviets Union like an unstoppable tide. But by June 1944, the tide had long since turned. The German Wehrmacht, once seemingly invincible, had been bleeding away its strength in a war of attrition it could not win. Yet here in Belarus, Army Group Center remained, nearly 800,000 men, veteran soldiers who had survived 3 brutal years of combat on the Eastern Front, experienced commanders who understood modern warfare, artillery, fortifications, defensive positions that had been strengthened and reinforced over months of relative calm. The soldiers of Army Group Center represented the cream of what remained of Germany's fighting power in the East. These were not the raw recruits and hastily assembled units that would characterize German forces in the war's final year. These were hardened combat veterans, men who had fought through the terrible winters, who had survived Soviet counteroffensives, who knew both how to attack and how to defend. Their commanders were experienced, field officers, many of them decorated veterans of campaigns across Europe and Russia. The defensive line they occupied stretched for over 600 miles, anchored on key cities that controlled the vital road and rail networks of Belarus. In the north stood Vitebsk, an ancient city on the western Dvina River, controlling the northern approach to the region. To the south of Vitebsk lay Orsha, sitting astride the critical Moscow-Minsk highway, the main artery connecting the Soviet capital to the west. Further south was Mogilev on the Dnieper River, another crucial junction point. And in the southern sector stood Bobruisk, a fortress city that controlled the approaches through the Pripyat marshes. These cities weren't just strategic points on a map. They were the hinges on which the entire German defensive system in Belarus depended. Control these cities, and you controlled the roads, the railways, the river crossings. Lose them, and the entire front would collapse. Hitler understood this. His generals understood this. What they failed to understand or refused to acknowledge was that the Soviet Union was about to strike with a force unlike anything the Wehrmacht had yet encountered. By the spring of 1944, the strategic situation for Nazi Germany had become increasingly desperate. In the West, the Allies were preparing for the long-anticipated invasion of France. Everyone knew it was coming. The only questions were when and where. In Italy, Allied armies were grinding their way north against stubborn German resistance, tying down divisions that were desperately needed elsewhere. And in the East, the Red Army had been steadily pushing westward, recapturing vast swathes of Soviet territory, inflicting losses that Germany could not replace. The German High Command, the Oberkommando des Heer, faced an impossible strategic dilemma. Forces were needed everywhere. There were never enough men, never enough tanks, never enough ammunition. Choices had to be made about where to concentrate limited reserves, where to accept risk, where to maintain strength. And in the spring of 1944, German intelligence made a decision that would prove catastrophic. They looked at the disposition of Soviet forces and concluded that the main summer offensive would come not in Belarus, but further south, in Ukraine. This assessment wasn't entirely unreasonable on its face. Ukraine was vital territory, rich in agricultural resources and raw materials. The industrial regions of the south were prize objectives, and Soviet forces in Ukraine had been active throughout the spring, conducting operations that suggested preparation for a major offensive. German intelligence observed the concentration of Soviet tank armies in the Ukraine sector. They noted the buildup of supplies, the movement of reserves, all signs that pointed toward an imminent offensive in the south. And so German armor, those precious mobile reserves that might have made a difference in Belarus, were shifted south to counter the expected threat. Panzer divisions that might have provided Army Group Center with the flexibility to respond to crisis were instead positioned to defend Ukraine. What German intelligence failed to detect, failed to understand despite mounting evidence to the contrary, was that they were being systematically deceived. The Soviet buildup in Ukraine was real enough, but it was also a carefully orchestrated deception, a massive exercise in strategic misdirection, designed to draw German attention and German strength away from the true target. And that target was Army Group Center. The man commanding Army Group Center in the spring of 1944 was General Field Marshal Ernst Busch, a career officer who had risen through the ranks of the German army over decades of service. Busch was a loyal soldier, a man who believed deeply in the chain of command, in following orders, in the Prussian military tradition of duty and obedience. These were admirable qualities in many circumstances. But in the spring and summer of 1944, facing an enemy that was growing stronger while his own forces grew weaker, these qualities would prove disastrous. Busch could see the danger his army group faced. The front line was overextended, stretching his forces thin. Soviet activity opposite his positions was increasing. Intelligence reports, however incomplete, suggested that something was building, and his army group lacked the mobile reserves necessary to respond effectively to a major breakthrough. If the Soviets attacked in strength, if they broke through his defensive lines, Army Group Center would be in desperate trouble without the ability to maneuver, without the flexibility to respond. In May 1944, Busch took his concerns directly to Hitler. He presented two proposals, two plans that might have saved hundreds of thousands of German lives. The first was a modest withdrawal to the Dnieper River, which would shorten his defensive line and create operational reserves. The second was a more substantial fallback to the Berezina River, which would place Army Group Center in a far more defensible position with reserves to counter any Soviet breakthrough. Both proposals made sound military sense. Both were based on the tactical and strategic realities of the situation. Both acknowledged the fundamental truth that Army Group Center, as currently positioned, was dangerously vulnerable. And Hitler rejected both plans out of hand. Not just rejected them, but ridiculed them. Mocked Busch for even suggesting retreat. Made it absolutely clear that no withdrawal, no matter how tactically sound, would be permitted. This was the fatal mistake, not the only mistake Germany made in the summer of 1944, but perhaps the most consequential. Because Hitler didn't just reject Busch's proposals. He doubled down on his insistence that Army Group Center hold every inch of ground. He formalized his rejection into a rigid system that removed all flexibility from German commanders at every level. Hitler ordered that the key cities of Belarus be designated as Festplätze, fortress cities. Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, Bobruisk, and others were to be held at all costs, not as temporary strongpoints that could be evacuated if circumstances required, not as positions to be defended while forces maneuvered around them, but as fortresses to be held to the last man, to the last bullet, regardless of the tactical situation, regardless of whether they could be effectively supplied or reinforced. This concept of fortress cities had been tried before in the East. It had failed repeatedly. Stalingrad had been a fortress city, and the Sixth Army had been destroyed there. Other strongpoints had been bypassed, surrounded, and eventually overwhelmed. The historical record was clear. Static defense in the face of Soviet offensive operations was a recipe for encirclement and destruction. But Hitler remained convinced that holding ground, any ground, was more important than preserving armies. The psychology behind this decision was complex, rooted in Hitler's worldview and his understanding or misunderstanding of military history. He believed that the Wehrmacht's retreat from Moscow in the winter of 1941-42 had nearly led to complete collapse, and that only his order to stand fast had saved the army from a Napoleonic disaster. This belief, whether accurate or not, had become an article of faith. Retreat was weakness. Retreat was cowardice. Real soldiers stood and fought regardless of odds. But there was also a more practical consideration, however misguided. Hitler believed that every kilometer of territory given up would have to be reconquered at enormous cost. He was convinced that Soviet offensive power would eventually exhaust itself against determined German resistance. If German forces could hold key positions, could force the Soviets to attack fortified strongpoints repeatedly, the Red Army would bleed itself white and the German front could be stabilized. This thinking ignored several crucial realities. First, by mid-1944, Soviet offensive power was not declining but increasing. The Red Army had learned from its early mistakes, had developed sophisticated operational art, had built up massive material superiority thanks to Soviet industrial production and American Lend-Lease aid. Second, static defense without mobile reserves wasn't a formula for attrition warfare, but for encirclement and annihilation. Third, and most importantly, the rigidity of the fortress city concept removed the most important advantage German forces still possessed: the professional competence of their commanders at the tactical and operational levels. German officers were trained in a command philosophy called Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics. Commanders were given objectives and left to determine how best to achieve them using their own judgment and initiative. This approach had served the Wehrmacht well, allowing rapid adaptation to changing battlefield conditions. But Hitler's fortress city order eliminated this flexibility entirely. Commanders could not retreat. They could not maneuver. They could not even shorten their lines without explicit permission from Hitler himself, permission that would not be granted. Initiative was replaced by rigid obedience to impossible orders. General Hans Jordan, commanding the Ninth Army in the southern sector of Army Group Center, understood exactly what this meant. He later recalled his assessment with bitter clarity. The inflexibility of being unable to fall back to new defensive lines would be absolutely disastrous. If a Soviet offensive broke through, his army would have to either adopt mobile defense or watch its front be completely smashed. Hitler had made mobile defense impossible. And so Army Group Center sat in its positions through May and into June, bound by orders that made no accommodation for military reality. The commanders knew they were vulnerable. The soldiers in the forward positions could see Soviet activity increasing across the front, but the orders were clear: hold where you stand. The fortress cities would be defended to the last man. No retreat, not one step back. While Army Group Center waited, forbidden to maneuver, forbidden even to prepare fallback positions, the Soviet Union was orchestrating one of the most sophisticated deception operations of the entire war. The Soviet term for military deception was maskirovka, a word that encompasses far more than simple camouflage. Maskirovka was comprehensive. Coordinated deception operating at every level from strategic to tactical, designed to mislead the enemy about intentions, capabilities, and dispositions. The Soviets had been developing maskirovka techniques throughout the war, learning from each offensive, refining their methods. By 1944, they had raised military deception to an art form. And for Operation Bagration, as the planned summer offensive against Army Group Center would be called, they executed perhaps their most successful deception campaign of the entire war. The foundation of the deception was convincing German intelligence that the main Soviet summer offensive would come in the south, in Ukraine, rather than in Belarus. This required not just hiding Soviet preparations in Belarus, but actively creating the impression of preparations in Ukraine. The two tasks had to be accomplished simultaneously, and both had to be executed flawlessly. In Ukraine, Soviet forces maintained high levels of activity throughout May and early June. Tank armies that had been fighting in the south remained there, their presence noted by German aerial reconnaissance and intelligence services. Supplies flowed into Ukraine, headquarters were established. All the visible preparations for a major offensive were evident to German observers, and German intelligence interpreted these preparations exactly as they were meant to, as evidence that Ukraine would be the target of the summer offensive. But the Ukraine buildup was theater, a carefully staged performance. The real preparations were happening in Belarus, and they were being conducted with extraordinary secrecy and discipline. The Soviet plan for Operation Bagration called for concentrating approximately 2.3 million troops, over 5,800 tanks and assault guns, more than 32,000 artillery pieces and mortars, and nearly 8,000 aircraft against Army Group Center. Moving this enormous force into position without alerting German intelligence required meticulous planning and strict operational security. Soviet units moved at night. Radio silence was maintained rigorously. When radio communications were necessary, they were disguised or transmitted from false locations to mislead German signals intelligence. Dummy radio traffic was generated in areas where no actual concentration was occurring. False tank armies were created on paper and their movements tracked by German intelligence, drawing attention away from real movements. In the Pripyat marshes, long thought by German commanders to be impassable to armor, Soviet engineers constructed wooden causeways under cover of darkness. These makeshift roads would allow tanks to move through terrain the Germans considered tank-proof. When the offensive began, Soviet armor would emerge from the swamps themselves, achieving complete tactical surprise in a sector the Germans thought secure. Soviet partisan forces operating behind German lines played a crucial role in the deception and in preparing for the offensive. Partisan units, now under tight Soviet military control and coordination, received detailed orders for a campaign of sabotage timed to coincide with the offensive. Between June 19th and 23rd, partisan groups would attack German rail lines throughout Belarus, disrupting supply and reinforcement efforts at the critical moment. The partisan operation was codenamed Rail War, and it was executed with devastating effectiveness. On the night of June 19th to 20th alone, partisans detonated over 10,500 demolition charges on rail lines throughout Belarus. Bridges were destroyed, track was torn up, supply trains were derailed. When the Soviet offensive began, German units would find themselves cut off from supplies and unable to receive reinforcements or evacuate by rail. The partisan campaign was another element of the operational plan, another layer of coordination that demonstrated how far Soviet military art had advanced. Meanwhile, German intelligence was picking up some evidence of Soviet preparations in Belarus. It was impossible to move over 2 million men into position without any trace being detected. Some German units reported increased Soviet activity opposite their positions. Some reconnaissance detected concentrations of artillery, but these reports were discounted or explained away. The main offensive would clearly come in Ukraine. The activity in Belarus was probably a feint, a diversionary attack meant to draw German reserves away from the real battle in the south. This assessment was reinforced by the disposition of Soviet tank armies, the Red Army's strategic mobile reserves. In April, all 5 of the Soviet Union's tank armies were positioned opposite Army Group North Ukraine, in the southern sector of the front. German intelligence tracked their positions carefully. Surely, the Germans reasoned, the Soviets would not launch a major offensive without committing their tank armies. Therefore, the main offensive must come where the tank armies were concentrated. What German intelligence failed to understand was that the tank armies in the south served dual purposes. They were real combat formations capable of offensive operations in Ukraine, but they also served as bait, drawing German attention and German mobile reserves to the southern sector. When Operation Bagration began, those tank armies would conduct their own offensive operations in Ukraine, but only after Army Group Center had been engaged, only after German reserves had been committed to Belarus, and could not be shifted south. The deception was multi-layered and mutually reinforcing. Every element supported every other element. False intelligence pointed to Ukraine. Real forces in Ukraine confirmed the intelligence. Masking operations hid preparations in Belarus. When evidence of those preparations couldn't be completely hidden, the context of the Ukraine deception caused German intelligence to dismiss them as secondary. It was a masterpiece of operational deception, and it worked perfectly. General Reinhard Gehlen, chief of German intelligence for the Eastern Front, later admitted that his organization had been systematically deceived. Despite fragments of accurate intelligence, despite warning from some field commanders, German intelligence had convinced itself that the main offensive would come in the south. And so, when Operation Bagration was launched, Army Group Center faced overwhelming force with minimal reserves and no freedom to maneuver. The Germans had been outthought, outplanned, and outmaneuvered before the first shot was fired. The date chosen for the offensive was itself laden with symbolism. June 22, 1944. Exactly 3 years to the day after Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union that began the war in the East. On June 22, 1941, German armies had struck across the Soviet frontier, achieving complete tactical surprise, destroying Soviet forces by the hundreds of thousands. Driving deep into Soviet territory in what seemed an unstoppable blitzkrieg. Now, 3 years later, the tables had turned completely. At 5 o'clock on the morning of June 22, 1944, Soviet artillery opened fire along the entire length of the Belarusian front. The bombardment was overwhelming in its intensity, a concentration of firepower that dwarfed anything the Wehrmacht had encountered before. Over 30,000 artillery pieces and heavy mortars, carefully positioned and supplied with enormous stocks of ammunition, began systematically destroying German forward positions. The Soviet artillery tactics had evolved considerably since the war's early years. This wasn't merely random bombardment. It was a carefully orchestrated symphony of destruction. The barrage was conducted in rolling waves, first targeting German front-line positions, then shifting to communication trenches and strongpoints, then back to the forward trenches as German soldiers attempted to reoccupy them. The goal was to isolate German units, destroy their communications, and create gaps in the defensive line that Soviet assault troops could exploit. For German soldiers in the forward positions, the bombardment was a terrifying experience. The earth itself seemed to erupt in continuous explosions. Trenches collapsed, bunkers caved in, communications lines were severed. Within hours, many German units were completely cut off from higher headquarters. Unable to report their situation, unable to receive orders, fighting isolated battles without coordination or support. Following the artillery barrage came Soviet air attacks. Nearly 8,000 aircraft, representing overwhelming air superiority, struck German positions throughout Belarus. Headquarters were bombed, supply depots were destroyed. Road junctions were interdicted. German air reconnaissance, already limited by fuel shortages and Soviet air superiority, became nearly impossible. Army Group Center was being systematically blinded and isolated. Then came the assault troops. Soviet infantry, supported by tanks and assault guns, attacked German positions across a front over 400 miles wide. The scale was staggering. 4 Soviet fronts, the equivalent of Western Army groups, attacked simultaneously. In the north, the 1st Baltic Front and 3rd Belarusian Front converged on Vitebsk. In the center, the 2nd Belarusian Front attacked toward Mogilev. In the south, the 1st Belarusian Front struck at Bobruisk. The attacks were coordinated, mutually supporting, designed to prevent German forces from shifting reserves from one sector to another. The fortress cities, those positions Hitler had ordered defended to the last man, became death traps within days. Vitebsk, in the northern sector, was the first to be surrounded. German commanders on the spot, seeing the disaster developing, requested permission to withdraw. The request was denied. Vitebsk was a fortress city. It would be held. 28,000 German soldiers of the 53rd Corps were trapped in the city as Soviet forces closed the encirclement. General Georg Hans Reinhardt, commanding 3rd Panzer Army, watched his northern flank disintegrate. His forces were outnumbered roughly 7-1. Soviet tanks poured through gaps in his lines. Communications with surrounded units became sporadic, then ceased entirely. He pleaded with higher headquarters for permission to allow Vitebsk to be evacuated while escape was still possible. The answer came back from Hitler himself. Vitebsk must be held. A general staff officer would be parachuted into the city to personally deliver Hitler's orders to fight to the last man. Fortunately, the order to parachute an officer into the doomed city was ignored by local commanders. On the morning of June 26th, the garrison attempted to break out. Without heavy equipment, without adequate supplies, approximately 8,000 men managed to fight their way through Soviet encirclement, and rejoin German lines to the west. But 20,000 men remained trapped in Vitebsk, and they fought there until the city fell on June 27th. The entire 53rd Corps was destroyed, removed from the German order of battle. Orsha, sitting astride the Moscow-Minsk highway, was supposed to be impregnable. Designated a Festaplatz like Vitebsk, it had been fortified with pillboxes, bunkers, extensive minefields. The German 78th Sturm Division, specially trained for defensive warfare, manned these positions. But Soviet assault engineers, equipped with mine-clearing tanks and specialized equipment, systematically reduced these defenses. Wave after wave of assault troops attacked through the fortified belt. Soviet tanks pushed up the main highway toward Minsk at astonishing speed. By the evening of June 26th, Orsha had fallen. The entire defensive system anchoring the center of Fourth Army's position had collapsed. Soviet mechanized forces, Pavel Rotmistrov's Fifth Guards Tank Army, poured through the gap, racing west toward the Berezina River. German units to the north and south of Orsha found themselves bypassed, cut off, fighting desperately to withdraw westward before they too were encircled. In the center of the German line around Mogilev, the situation was equally catastrophic. The Second Belarusian Front attacked Fourth Army's positions with overwhelming force. The German 39th Panzer Corps, despite its name lacking any significant armored strength, found its defenses penetrated within hours. Soviet forces crossed the Dnieper north of Mogilev, threatening to encircle the entire Fourth Army. German commanders begged for permission to withdraw before the trap closed. Permission was denied. General Kurt von Tippelskirch, temporarily commanding Fourth Army, finally disobeyed his orders. Recognizing that his entire army faced annihilation if it remained in position, he ordered a withdrawal toward the Berezina River. Busch, faithful to Hitler's directives, was furious. He screamed at Tippelskirch over the telephone, "Your behavior is in contravention with the Führer's orders." Tippelskirch, to his credit, was unmoved. He would save what remained of his army or die trying. Blind obedience to suicidal orders no longer seemed like duty, but madness. But Tippelskirch's defiance came too late for many of his units. The 39th Panzer Corps was effectively destroyed. The 12th Corps sent its last radio message and then vanished into the chaos of retreat and encirclement. Mogilev fell on June 28th, and thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured in the surrounding battles. The center of Army Group Center's line had collapsed completely. In the south, at Bobruisk, the situation was, if anything, worse. General Konstantin Rokossovsky's First Belarusian Front attacked the city in a double envelopment from north and south. The German Ninth Army, commanded by General Hans Jordan, found itself completely surrounded. Over 40,000 men were trapped in and around the city. The Soviets subjected the pocket to intensive artillery bombardment and air attack. The soldiers trapped in Bobruisk faced a nightmare. Supplies ran out. Casualties mounted. The wounded could not be evacuated. Communications with the outside world became sporadic. One German soldier who survived the encirclement later described the horror. Everywhere, dead people were lying. Dead bodies, wounded people, people screaming. You didn't have any feeling for warmth or coldness, or light, or darkness, or thirst. On June 27th, Hitler finally granted permission for a breakout from Bobruisk, but with a characteristically insane condition. One division must remain in the city to defend the fortress to the last man. Even in the face of complete disaster, even with an entire army facing annihilation, Hitler insisted on the fiction that fortress cities could be held. The breakout was attempted on the night of June 28th, led by the 20 surviving tanks of the 20th Panzer Division. Perhaps 15,000 men escaped. The rest were killed or captured when Soviet forces stormed the city on June 29th. Within a week of the offensive's start, the fortress cities that were supposed to be the anchors of Army Group Center's defense had all fallen. Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, Bobruisk, all captured or destroyed. And the worst was yet to come, because the fall of these cities wasn't the end of the disaster. It was merely the prelude. With the fortress cities fallen, with the Flanks of Army Group Center destroyed or in full retreat. Soviet mechanized forces exploited deep into the German rear. The Soviet concept of deep battle, developed in the 1920s and 30s, and finally being executed to perfection, called for mobile forces to penetrate far behind enemy lines, disrupting command and control, cutting supply lines, and creating conditions for massive encirclements. This was exactly what happened in late June 1944. Soviet tank armies drove west along parallel axes, racing to converge on Minsk, the capital of Belarus, and the vital transportation hub for the entire region. Behind them, German units that had survived the initial onslaught tried desperately to retreat westward, but they were retreating into a trap. Soviet forces were moving faster than the German foot-mobile infantry could march. Road junctions were seized before German columns could reach them. River crossings were captured or destroyed. Retreat became a desperate race against encirclement. 4. German soldiers on the ground. The retreat was a hellish experience. Soviet aircraft dominated the skies, making movement by day nearly suicidal. Soviet tanks appeared at crossroads, cutting off retreat routes. Partisan groups emerged from the forests to attack German columns. Units lost contact with higher headquarters, with neighboring formations, sometimes even with their own regiments. Men navigated by instinct and desperation, heading west toward the setting sun, hoping to reach German lines before the trap closed completely. By July 3rd, Soviet forces had captured Minsk. The city fell with stunning speed, and its capture meant that tens of thousands of German soldiers were now trapped east of the city, surrounded by Soviet forces. The Fourth Army, or what remained of it, was encircled. Elements of Ninth Army that had escaped Bobruisk were encircled. Stragglers from 3rd Panzer Army were encircled. Over 100,000 German soldiers found themselves in what became known as the Minsk pocket, cut off from supply, from reinforcement, from any hope of relief. The trapped forces fought on for several more days, but their fate was sealed. Some units tried to break out. Most failed. Soviet forces methodically reduced the pocket, using artillery and air power to destroy resistance. On July 8th, organized resistance in the pocket ended. Some Germans managed to escape through Soviet lines in small groups, navigating by night, hiding by day. But the vast majority were killed or captured. Stalin, ever conscious of propaganda and symbolism, ordered that 57,000 German prisoners captured at Minsk be marched through the streets of Moscow on July 17th. It was a deliberate echo of ancient Roman triumphs, a demonstration to the world of Soviet power and German defeat. The column of prisoners, including captured generals, marched through the Soviet capital while crowds watched. It was a humiliation calculated to break German morale and demonstrate that the supposedly invincible Wehrmacht was being systematically destroyed. But the offensive didn't stop with Minsk. Having achieved their initial objectives ahead of schedule, Soviet forces continued to push westward. Throughout July and into August, the Red Army advanced into what had been eastern Poland before 1939, into Lithuania, toward the borders of East Prussia itself. Army Group North, positioned in the Baltic states, found itself cut off as Soviet forces reached the Baltic Sea. German forces throughout the Eastern Front reeled backward under the weight of successive Soviet offensives. The statistics of destruction were staggering. In the space of 5 weeks, Army Group Center had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent military force. Of the 38 divisions that comprised the Army Group in June, 28 were completely destroyed. Official German casualty figures listed 26,000 killed, 110,000 wounded, and 263,000 captured or missing. But these figures were misleading. Many of those listed as missing were actually dead, killed in encirclements or during the chaotic retreat. More realistic estimates suggest that over 300,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured during Operation Bagration. The loss of equipment was equally catastrophic. Over 2,000 tanks and assault guns were destroyed or captured. More than 57,000 vehicles of all types were lost. Thousands of artillery pieces fell into Soviet hands. The material losses represented months of German production. irreplaceable equipment that the Reich's shrinking industrial base could not quickly replace. The loss of experienced personnel was even more devastating. These were veteran soldiers and experienced officers, the kind of combat leaders Germany could no longer adequately replace or train. To put these losses in perspective, they exceeded the disaster at Stalingrad. The Sixth Army, trapped and destroyed at Stalingrad, numbered about 250,000 men. The losses in Operation Bagration exceeded 300,000, possibly approaching 400,000 if missing soldiers presumed dead are included. It was the single greatest defeat the German army suffered in a single operation during the entire war. It was, by any measure, a catastrophe of the first magnitude, and it was a catastrophe that could have been avoided, or at least mitigated. Not completely, certainly. The Soviet Union had accumulated overwhelming material superiority by mid-1944. The Red Army had learned its craft, had developed effective operational art, had commanders who understood modern warfare. Germany would have lost battles in Belarus regardless of Hitler's decisions, but the scope of the disaster, the complete and irretrievable destruction of an entire army group, that was the direct result of Hitler's fatal mistake. The insistence on static defense, the fortress city concept, the absolute prohibition on any withdrawal or maneuver. If Busch's proposals in May had been accepted, if Army Group Center had been allowed to shorten its lines and create mobile reserves, the outcome would have been different. German forces would still have been outnumbered. They still would have faced overwhelming Soviet firepower, but they would have had room to maneuver, space to conduct fighting withdrawals, the flexibility to respond to Soviet breakthroughs with counterattacks. Many men who died in the fortress cities or the Minsk encirclement might have survived to fight another day if German commanders on the ground had been allowed to exercise their own judgment, to retreat when retreat was the only tactically sound option, to preserve their forces rather than sacrifice them pointlessly. The disaster would have been less complete. Vitebsk might have been evacuated before encirclement. Orsha might have been held longer or abandoned earlier, depending on tactical circumstances. The Fourth Army might have withdrawn in good order rather than being encircled and destroyed piecemeal. But Hitler's no-retreat order eliminated all these options. It transformed every defensive position into a potential death trap. It removed the one advantage German forces still possessed over their Soviet opponents: superior tactical flexibility and command initiative. It played directly into Soviet hands, allowing the Red Army to isolate and destroy German forces in detail, rather than having to fight through successive defensive lines in costly attritional battles. Hitler, characteristically, never accepted responsibility for the disaster. When news of the catastrophe reached his headquarters, his response was to blame his commanders. Busch was sacked on June 28th, replaced by Field Marshal Walter Model, one of Germany's most capable defensive specialists. But even Model couldn't salvage the situation. He managed to stabilize the front eventually, but only after Soviet forces had advanced hundreds of miles, only after Army Group Center had been virtually destroyed, only after the road to Berlin lay open. Other commanders were dismissed or reassigned. Accusations of defeatism and cowardice were leveled against officers who had the temerity to suggest that retreat might be preferable to annihilation. Hitler ranted about betrayal, about weakness, about the need for even greater fanaticism in defense. He issued even more stringent orders forbidding withdrawal under any circumstances, but these measures were meaningless. The damage was done. Germany no longer had the resources to recover from such losses. The strategic consequences of Operation Bagration extended far beyond the immediate battlefield losses. The destruction of Army Group Center opened the entire eastern approach to Germany. Soviet forces now stood on the borders of East Prussia, the heartland of Prussian militarism, threatening Germany proper for the first time. The Baltic states were cut off, with Army Group North trapped in what would become the Courland pocket, isolated and useless for the rest of the war. The timing of Operation Bagration, launched while Allied forces were still establishing themselves in Normandy, meant that Germany was now truly fighting a two-front war with inadequate resources for either theater. Troops and equipment desperately needed in the west to contain the Allied breakout from Normandy couldn't be spared because of the crisis in the east. Forces needed in the east to stabilize the front line couldn't be transferred because of the threat in the west. Germany's strategic position had become hopeless. The psychological impact was equally devastating. The myth of German military superiority, already badly damaged by Stalingrad and Kursk, was definitively shattered. German soldiers on every front now knew that they were fighting a losing war against enemies who outnumbered them, outproduced them, and increasingly outfought them. Morale, that intangible but crucial factor in military effectiveness, began to collapse. Desertions increased. The willingness to fight to the death for hopeless causes declined. Wehrmacht was beginning to break not just materially, but spiritually. For the Soviet Union, Operation Bagration was vindication. Years of terrible losses, of desperate defensive battles, of slow and costly advances had led to this moment. The Red Army had proven it could defeat the Wehrmacht decisively in offensive operations, could conduct complex multi-front operations, could achieve strategic surprise against a capable enemy. Soviet commanders like Zhukov, Vasilevsky, Rokossovsky, and others had demonstrated that they were among the finest operational commanders of the war. The operation also demonstrated the effectiveness of Soviet operational art, particularly the concepts of deep battle and maskirovka. The ability to deceive the enemy about intentions, to achieve surprise despite the massive scale of preparations, to penetrate deep behind enemy lines and create conditions for encirclement, these were sophisticated capabilities that reflected years of development and hard-won experience. The Red Army of 1944 bore little resemblance to the Red Army of 1941, and Operation Bagration proved it. For students of military history, Operation Bagration offers profound lessons about the nature of modern warfare and the consequences of strategic inflexibility. The strongest army, equipped with experienced soldiers and competent commanders, can be destroyed if it is deprived of the flexibility to maneuver. Static defense without mobile reserves is an invitation to encirclement and annihilation. Rigid adherence to politically motivated orders, no matter how unrealistic, leads to disaster. These are truths that transcend the specific circumstances of 1944, applicable to any era of warfare. The operation also demonstrates the crucial importance of accurate intelligence and the danger of mirror imaging, of assuming the enemy will act as you expect them to act. German intelligence convinced itself that the main Soviet offensive would come in the south because that's where a German offensive would have been launched. They failed to account for Soviet strategic thinking, for Soviet capabilities, for Soviet deception efforts. This failure of intelligence, compounded by rigid defensive doctrine, created the conditions for catastrophe. Perhaps most importantly, Operation Bagration illustrates the fundamental truth that pride and ideology are poor substitutes for military realism. Hitler's insistence on holding every inch of conquered territory, his equation of retreat with weakness, his belief that fanaticism could overcome material disadvantage, these beliefs were not just wrong, but disastrously counterproductive. They cost hundreds of thousands of German lives, destroyed an entire army group, and hastened Germany's ultimate defeat. In the summer of 1944, Germany still had soldiers. It still had tanks. It still had commanders who understood their craft. What it lacked was the wisdom to acknowledge reality, the flexibility to adapt to circumstances, the humility to accept that strategic retreat could sometimes be the path to eventual survival. And that lack, that fatal combination of rigidity and delusion, cost Germany an entire army. The roads leading east from Minsk in the weeks after the battle were lined with destroyed German equipment. Burned-out tanks sat at crossroads. Abandoned artillery pieces rusted in fields. Graves, marked and unmarked, stretched for miles. The physical remnants of Army Group Center littered the landscape of Belarus, silent testimony to the consequences of strategic inflexibility. History remembers battles for many reasons. Some battles are remembered for their tactical brilliance, others for their strategic significance. still others for their human drama. Operation Bagration deserves to be remembered for all these reasons, but perhaps most importantly, as a cautionary tale about the dangers of inflexibility, about the catastrophic consequences when ideology replaces military judgment, about what happens when pride prevents adaptation to reality. The soldiers of Army Group Center deserved better than they received. Many of them were brave men, following orders as they had been trained to do, fighting against overwhelming odds without the flexibility or freedom to make tactically sound decisions. Their destruction wasn't the result of cowardice or incompetence. It was the result of a command system that prioritized obedience over effectiveness, that valued holding ground over preserving armies, that replaced military judgment with ideological rigidity. One decision, one mistake. The refusal to allow Army Group Center any flexibility to maneuver, to shorten lines, to conduct strategic withdrawals when tactically necessary. That single mistake made in the spring of 1944 and rigidly maintained throughout the summer cost Germany not just a battle, but an entire army. It opened the road to Berlin. It demonstrated beyond question that Germany had lost the war in the East. And it proved that wars, whatever else they may be about, are ultimately lost not by lack of courage or lack of equipment, but by failure of strategic wisdom. The lesson stands clear across the decades. Even the strongest force can be destroyed by the rigidity of those who command it. Flexibility, adaptation, realistic assessment of capabilities and limitations, these are the foundations of military effectiveness. Without them, all the valor and skill and equipment in the world cannot prevent disaster. Germany learned this lesson in the forests and fields of Belarus in the summer of 1944. The cost of that lesson was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of lives, an entire army group, any realistic hope of continuing the war in the East. It was a lesson paid for in blood and defeat, a mistake that cost Germany an entire army and hastened the Reich's final collapse. If you found this exploration of Operation Bagration informative, please like and subscribe for more detailed examinations of World War II's pivotal moments. The stories of these battles deserve to be told with the nuance and complexity they warrant, lessons from history that remain relevant long after the guns have fallen silent.